The moment the doors opened, every head in the room turned, and not toward the view. The Hargrove Center sat on the edge of downtown Ottawa, 40 years old and recently renovated, the kind of building that looked permanent. On the 14th floor, the annual staff recognition gala of Meridian Health Network moved through its familiar rituals. The ballroom had been rented again, the same florist had arranged white orchids along every table, and the same speeches would be given in the same order by the same people. Tradition, they called it, a word that in this building often meant, "Don't ask questions." Thomas Breck noticed her the moment he arrived. She was standing near the far wall, beside a high-top table no one had claimed, holding a glass of sparkling water, with both hands the way a person holds something when they have nowhere to put it. She was wearing a dark green dress, simple, well-made. Her hair was pulled back on one side. She looked like someone who had dressed carefully for an evening that had then, almost immediately, decided not to include her. Thomas took his jacket from the coat check and didn't move toward the bar right away. He watched instead, the way he had trained himself to watch over 31 years as a structural engineer, quietly, without judgment, gathering information before drawing any conclusions. No one approached her. Not the group of administrators clustered near the windows. Not the two nurses from neurology he recognized from the elevator, laughing with their backs turned to the room. Not the woman from HR who had sent out the invitation email with his name misspelled, who was now working the perimeter with the practiced warmth of someone who needed to be seen being friendly. No one. Thomas accepted a glass of water from a passing server and moved to a spot beside one of the room's square columns, where he could see the whole floor without being in the middle of it. He did this at every event, had done it for years. His colleague Marcus Holt called it his lighthouse position. Thomas just thought of it as thinking room. The woman at the far table glanced toward the door twice, not nervously, but with a particular kind of stillness, the kind that takes effort. He knew that stillness. He recognized it from the inside. Her name, he would learn later, was Claire Voss. She was a respiratory therapist who had transferred to Meridian from a hospital in Winnipeg 8 months ago, and in those 8 months, she had become, through no act of her own, the kind of person a room decided not to notice. But Thomas didn't know any of that yet. He only knew what he could see. He stayed at his column. A server offered him a canapé from a rectangular tray, and he took one without looking at it, his attention still on the room's geometry, the way people moved within it, the invisible lines they obeyed without knowing they obeyed them. The table where Claire stood was outside those lines. Marcus found him 20 minutes later, which was about 12 minutes longer than usual. "You found the column," Marcus said. "It's a good column." Marcus followed his gaze across the room, briefly, and then looked back at Thomas with the expression he used when he had something to say and was choosing his words. "You see, Kessler's already here. I saw. They're saying he's getting the Director of Operations role. Official announcement tonight." Thomas looked toward the cluster near the windows, where Dr. Hartley Kessler stood in the manner of a man who had already received the announcement. He was 43, tall, wore his suits as if he'd been born in them. He had, as far as Thomas could determine, never once arrived at a meeting having read the materials beforehand. He moved through Meridian with the confidence of someone who understood that in this building, confidence was often mistaken for competence. "Good for him," Thomas said. Marcus waited a moment. "You don't mean that." "Not entirely," Thomas agreed. Marcus laughed, a short, honest sound, then drifted toward the bar. Thomas returned to watching the room. What he noticed over the next 15 minutes was not dramatic. It never was. It was small. It was the kind of small that accumulates like water finding the lowest point in a floor. 2 women walked past Claire's table without slowing, though one of them looked directly at her and then looked away. A department head Thomas recognized, Fiona Marsh, administrator for Allied Health, crossed the room and stopped to speak to nearly every person in her path, including a server she apparently knew. She did not stop at Claire's table. Her path curved around it with the smoothness of a river around a stone. Claire adjusted her glass. She did not look around the room with expectation anymore. She had, by this point, removed expectation from her posture entirely. Thomas set his water down on the column's narrow ledge. He thought about what he had planned for the evening. He would stay for the speeches. He would congratulate Kessler briefly and without warmth, because that was the professional thing to do. He would find Margaret Chen, the retiring chief of medical imaging, who had advocated for his structural review team 3 years ago when no one else would, and he would tell her properly that the department wouldn't be the same. Then he would leave before dessert, take the LRT home, and be in bed by 10. He thought about this plan. He looked at the woman standing alone beside the unclaimed table. He picked up his water glass again and walked across the room. She saw him coming, he could tell, and for a half-second something moved across her expression. A question, maybe a faint wariness. The kind of look people wear when they've learned that attention in a room like this is not always neutral. He stopped at a reasonable distance, not too close, and said, "I notice this table doesn't have a centerpiece. I think that means it's structurally optional." She looked at the table. There was, in fact, no orchid arrangement on it. "I hadn't thought of it that way," she said. "Thomas Breck," he said. "Structural review, Claire Voss, respiratory therapy. You transferred from Winnipeg." She paused. "You know that? Your ID badge says Misericordia Health Center before they put the Meridian sticker over it. The sticker is newer than about 8 months. He paused. "I pay attention to things. It's a professional habit and occasionally a social inconvenience." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than that, but in the same direction. "How long have you been with Meridian?" she asked. 12 years in this building. Before that, the infrastructure group at Ottawa General. He looked around the room briefly. Before that, a construction site in Sudbury where nobody wore ties and the coffee was better. This time, she did small, controlled, but genuine. "Sudbury," she said. "You've been?" "I grew up 2 hours north of it. Capriol. I know Capriol." He said it plainly, as a fact, not to impress. "Good hockey." She looked at him for a moment with the careful look of someone recalibrating a first impression. He was used to that. He had a face that people often mistook for blankness when it was actually patience. "The speeches start in 20 minutes, he said. "Before then, do you want to find something to eat that isn't canapés? The kitchen at these things always has proper food somewhere near the back." Claire looked at him again, a real look, not the surface glance she'd been getting all evening, and then she looked at the rest of the room, just briefly. He didn't follow her gaze. He didn't need to. "That sounds better than standing here," she said. They found the food near the service corridor exactly where Thomas had expected it. A long table with carved roast beef and 3 kinds of salmon and small roasted potatoes still holding their heat. They filled their plates, and Thomas found 2 chairs at a round table near the east window, beside an older cardiologist he nodded to and a younger man from facilities management who was busy with his phone. They sat down. He didn't ask her what she'd been doing standing alone. He didn't frame a question around it. He simply began talking in the way that he sometimes talked when he was not performing conversation but actually having one, about the building, about the renovation that had taken 2 years longer than projected, about what Ottawa looked like from the 14th floor when the river flooded in spring. She listened well, and then she talked, and he listened, and at some point, it stopped being 2 people filling silence and became something else, something with its own shape. She was from the north, the real north, not the north that people in Toronto meant when they said north. Her father had been a miner and her mother a school secretary, and she had learned to read people early, the way you learn when money is thin and mistakes cost more than they should. She had come to respiratory therapy sideways, through a summer job in a hospital that was supposed to last 3 months and lasted 20 years. She had been married. She had a daughter, 10 years old, who was currently at her grandmother's in Canada and who had very strong opinions about the best way to make macaroni and cheese. Thomas listened to all of it. He told her, when she asked, that he also had a child, a son 14, currently in the same room as a gaming headset and what Thomas suspected was an unseemly amount of tsh. He had been raising Daniel alone for 6 years, since the year after his wife Pauline's death from an illness that had moved faster than anyone expected. He said this matter-of-factly, not to invite sympathy, just as information about who he was. She received it the same way, which he appreciated. They talked through the main course and into the speeches, which neither of them paid much attention to. Kessler received his appointment to Director of Operations, to a round of applause that was warm in the way. Applause is warm when the room feels it should be. Thomas clapped with the same neutral energy he brought to most things that didn't require precision. Somewhere around 9 o'clock, he became aware that they were being watched, not dramatically, not in the way that required staring, but in the way that a shift in the room's attention makes itself known, a small change in the angle of nearby conversations, a stillness at certain tables. He noticed it the way he noticed everything, without much outward response. The next morning, Marcus would tell him that the watching had started before the speeches, that people had seen Thomas cross the room directly to Claire's table, and that this had produced something in the room, a kind of recalibration, because Thomas Breck was not someone you ignored. He had been at Meridian for 12 years. He had 3 years ago produced a structural review that exposed a safety issue in the East Wing that saved the hospital a regulatory shutdown. He was not flashy. He did not attend functions often, and when he did not circulate. But when Thomas Breck walked directly across a room and sat down somewhere, people noticed. What Marcus would also tell him, though in more careful language, was that some of those people had been embarrassed. That the same people who had curved their paths around Claire's table had spent the latter half of the evening finding reasons to walk past the window table instead. Thomas, when he heard this, would say only, "Is that right?" He did not say it with satisfaction. He said it with the flat evenness of a man who had expected it. But that was the next morning. Tonight, he was still at the window table, and Claire was saying something about the sound that a ventilator made in a quiet room, how she had learned to hear the difference between rhythms, the way some people learn to hear notes in music, and he was thinking that he had not had a conversation like this one in longer than he could immediately calculate. He didn't examine that thought. He filed it. At 9:30 the DJ started, because someone always ordered a DJ even though no one at a Meridian Health Network Gala had ever genuinely wanted one. The first few songs produced a loose cluster of people near the edge of the cleared floor, mostly younger staff, moving with the careful self-awareness of people who wanted to be seen dancing rather than people who wanted to dance. Thomas watched this from the window. Claire watched it too. "Do you dance?" he asked. She turned her head toward him. "Not typically at events like this, that's not what I asked." She looked at him for a moment. "I used to, before." She paused. "You?" "I was told once by a woman at a wedding that I dance like I'm reading a schematic," he said. I took it as a compliment. She didn't mean it as one. Claire laughed, a real one, unguarded, the kind that surprised her slightly, which he could tell by the way she pressed her lips together afterward, as if she hadn't been expecting to give that much away. He stood. "Come on," he said. "Not a question exactly, but not a directive either. Something in between, the kind of thing you could say no to without it costing anything." She looked at the dance floor. She looked at the room. He followed her gaze this time, only briefly, and he saw what she was measuring. The same people who had not seen her for 8 months, who would now absolutely see her, who would see her on this floor with Thomas Breck, and he understood the calculation she was running because it was a real one. "They're already watching," he said quietly. "That part is done." She was quiet for a moment, then she set down her glass. They were not the most graceful pair on the floor. Thomas had not lied about the schematic remark, but he found the rhythm and stayed in it. And she had clearly danced before and better than tonight. Though tonight was fine, and somewhere in the middle of a song Thomas couldn't name, the awareness of the room around them stopped being the main thing either of them was aware of. He noticed Fiona Marsh watching from the edge of the floor. He noticed Kessler's table, where the conversation had shifted in a particular way that Thomas could read but didn't need to. He noticed 2 of the nurses who had passed Claire's table earlier in the evening, now standing close together, talking in the low, quick way people talk when they are renegotiating what they think. He let all of it stay in his peripheral vision, where it belonged. The song ended. Another began, and they stayed for it, and then stepped off the floor, not because anyone made them feel they should, but simply because they were ready. They stood near the window again, the city below them, the river dark and wide at the edge of the lights. "I have a meeting at 7:30 tomorrow," Claire said. "I have a site inspection at 8. You should probably go." "Probably," he agreed. He didn't move immediately. She looked at him with the considering look she had given him early in the evening, when she was still deciding what kind of person he was. He had the sense she had decided, or was close to it, but that she was cautious in the way that people become cautious when they have been surprised before by how things changed. He respected that. "The coffee in structural review is decent," he said. "Better than Allied Health from what I've heard." She raised an eyebrow fractionally. "I hadn't heard anything about the coffee in Allied Health." "Neither had I," he said. It was a logical inference. The cautious thing in her expression moved, slightly, in the direction of the smile she'd given him earlier. "I might need to verify that independently," she said. "That would be the scientific approach," he agreed. They said goodnight in the corridor near the coat check, briefly, without ceremony. Thomas took the elevator down alone, watched the city through the lobby's glass doors while he waited for his ride, and thought about a few things. The schematic he needed to review before the inspection, the chips Daniel was probably still eating at this hour, the way a conversation could move from nothing into something without any single moment you could point to and say, "There, that's when it started." He wasn't sure what this was. He wasn't sure it was anything yet. That was all right. The car arrived, he got in, and the building receded behind him, its lit floors stacked one above the other, and somewhere up there the Gala was still running, and people who had decided not to see Claire Voss for 8 months were probably deciding, now, that they had always intended to. He thought, people are like buildings. The problems were always there. The only question is whether anyone bothers to look. The next morning, Marcus appeared in the doorway of Thomas's office at 8:47, which meant the inspection had run short. "How was the site?" Thomas asked without looking up. "Soft northeast corner." "Nothing critical." Marcus came in and sat in the chair he always sat in, the one that faced the window. "I heard you danced last night." Thomas turned a page in the report he was reading. "People talk. People always talk. That's the point." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "She's been having a rough go of it since Whitfield left." Thomas looked up. Marcus shifted in the chair. Owen Whitfield, manager of respiratory therapy. He and Claire, there was apparently a situation. Something before she transferred here. They knew each other. "I don't know the whole thing." He paused. "He's Kessler's golf partner. Has been for years." Thomas was still. "So when Kessler started moving up," Marcus said, "Whitfield moved with him. And Whitfield apparently has a particular way of moving forward." He said the last part carefully. "He doesn't leave things behind. He just makes sure they're not in the room." Thomas set the report down. He thought about the careful way the room had arranged itself around her, the paths that curved, the people who had looked and then looked away. 8 months of a woman standing at tables alone. "Does she know?" he asked. "I think she knows something," Marcus said. "Whether she knows the full shape of it." He stopped. "I don't know." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Kessler's got the director role now," he said. "As of last night, yes." Thomas picked up the report again, but he wasn't reading it. He was thinking about weight-bearing structures, and what happens when a load is distributed unevenly, and how a thing can appear stable long past the point where it is. "The East Wing Review," he said. "The one from 3 years ago." Marcus looked at him. "There were notes on that file," Thomas said. "Personnel files crossed with structural sign-offs. Whitfield signed off on a ventilation compliance report in 2021 that I flagged as incomplete." He turned a page. "I never followed up. I should follow up." Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then, "That would be a professional responsibility." "It would," Thomas agreed. The morning moved on. The site report came in. The East Wing file was retrieved from the archive by end of day, along with 3 others that had Whitfield's signature on compliance paperwork from the period when corners had been cut quietly and systematically, and the ventilation complaints from the 3rd floor ward had been attributed to seasonal variation rather than examined. Thomas did not hurry this. He was not built for hurrying things. He was built for reading structures carefully, for understanding which problems were cosmetic and which were foundational, for knowing that the work done in the quiet, unhurried middle is always the work that holds. He sent one email. 2 days later, it went to the compliance office and to the hospital's safety board, with copies to Margaret Chen, who was retiring but not yet gone. It was 4 paragraphs, precise and factual, with 3 attachments. He did not copy Kessler. He did not copy Whitfield. He went home, made dinner for Daniel, asked 3 questions about the school day and received 2-word answers to each, which he took as a successful conversation. He read for an hour before bed. He slept. 3 weeks passed before Claire Voss appeared in the doorway of the structural review office. Thomas was alone, Marcus having left early for a parent-teacher interview. She was still in her work scrubs, a cardigan over top. Her ID badge turned around the way people turn them at the end of a shift out of habit. "I heard something," she said. "Sit down," he said. He meant it as an invitation, not an instruction, and from her expression she received it that way. She sat in Marcus's chair, the one facing the window. She had heard, she told him, that a compliance review had been opened, that Whitfield was responding to questions about reports from 2021 and 2022, that Kessler, who had been in the role of Director of Operations for 11 days, was apparently also answering questions because the compliance office had found his signature beside Whitfield's on 2 of the supplementary approvals. She said this evenly, watching him while she said it. "I know it was you," she said when she finished. Thomas didn't confirm or deny this. He said, "Were there problems in the ventilation compliance that needed to be reviewed?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Patients in that ward were flagging more respiratory complications than the rate should have suggested. I wrote it in my intake notes 8 months ago." A pause. "Nothing happened." "Something is happening now," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, the same look she'd given him at the gala, careful and recalibrating, but with something added to it this time. Something that looked, he thought, like a person setting down a weight they had been carrying long enough that they'd stopped noticing it. "Why?" she asked, not accusingly, genuinely. He thought about how to answer that. "Because the problem was there," he said, "and I should have looked more carefully the first time." She was quiet. "The patients on that ward," he added, "they weren't structural abstractions." She nodded slowly. She looked out the window for a moment at the November sky over Ottawa, which was the color of old pewter and doing nothing to recommend itself. "My daughter made macaroni and cheese last week," Claire said after a moment. "She did the whole thing herself. She's 10. How was it?" "Terrible," Claire said. "She used the wrong pasta and forgot to salt the water. Did you tell her that?" "I told her it was the best I'd ever had." Thomas considered this. "That's probably the right call. She'll figure out the salt eventually." A pause. "Some things you have to let people arrive at themselves." He thought that might have been directed at more than the pasta, but he didn't say so. They sat in the quiet office for a few minutes, with the window and the pewter sky and the hum of the building settling around them. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. When she left, she stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. "The coffee and allied health is fine," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "Noted," he said. "My inference was flawed." "It was," she agreed. "You might want to verify things independently before drawing conclusions. That would be the scientific approach." He met her eyes across the room. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. She left. He listened to her footsteps down the corridor, steady and unhurried. He looked back at his desk. The East Wing file was still open, the 3rd attachment visible on his screen. A ventilation chart, a column of numbers, a date from 2 years ago when something had been wrong and nobody had made it their business to say so. He closed the file. He thought about Capriol. He thought about a 10-year-old who made terrible macaroni and cheese entirely by herself. He thought about a woman standing at a table that no one had claimed, holding a glass of water with both hands, and the small internal act it took to keep your posture straight when a room decided you weren't worth the trouble of seeing. He had done that once. For a long time after Pauline. He knew how much it cost. Outside, the Ottawa River was somewhere beyond the buildings, moving in its own direction, indifferent to the weather. The city was doing what cities do in November, carrying on, a little gray, a little stubborn, refusing to make anything easy. Thomas Breck turned to the next file on his desk. He had a lot of work to do, and he'd always found work clarifying, the kind of steady, careful attention that turned complicated problems into solvable ones. One measurement, one honest look at a time.